Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Mike Grace, and this is the KMG show for Thursday, July the 15th, 2021. Let me adjust this. That's a little better. So, all this week, I've been looking for news about South Africa because it appears to me what's going on in South Africa is important news, and I've been able to find precious little. I went to the main page of the New York Times this morning, nothing about South Africa. I went to CNN main page, nothing about South Africa. I went to the BBC's main page, nothing about South Africa. I went to the BBC World News page, one story about South Africa, which isn't about the ongoing collapse, something about the mining industry. And of course, there was nothing on Drudge about South Africa. I managed to find some things. A story yesterday, BBC, South Africa looting, I'm struggling to find food. Leading a comfortable life in South Africa's coastal city of Durban, John, not his real name, risks running out of food for the first time ever following the mass looting and burning of supermarkets and shops after protests over the imprisonment of former President Jacob Zuma spiraled out of control. Middle-class people like me now face shortages, he said. On Tuesday, I could not get bread and milk until I became aware through our neighborhood WhatsApp group of a community organization giving it out. I went to their hall. We had to queue, and each person was given 2 loaves of bread and 1 liter of milk. I don't know where they got the stocks from, but they gave out 8,000 loaves. On Wednesday, they don't have any. Durban, the main city in KwaZulu-Natal, is the political heartland of Zuma. Similar unrest has swept through the economic hub of Gauteng, but KwaZulu-Natal remains the main flashpoint, with the riots reaching or coming close to some affluent neighborhoods, terrifying shop owners and residents like John. He said that only 2 or 3 shops in his suburb remained open, and this was for only a few hours a day. We are stocking up on dry food and things like potatoes and onions. The shop owner said farms are inaccessible and there will be no vegetables once his stocks run out, John added. His other worry is medication for his chronically ill wife. Some of the big pharmaceutical chains have been looted or are closed. I went to a small pharmacy that is still open. I queued for 3 hours to get medication. Baby food and nappies are in huge demand, John said. There are also fears of fuel shortages, something most South Africans have never experienced in their lives. At my petrol station, only 1 pump is open. There are long queues. I have half a tank of petrol left. He does not need much fuel at the moment, though, as it is not safe to travel outside his suburb. Furthermore, some adjacent suburbs have been blocked off by residents who have formed neighborhood watch groups, or what local media call defense squads, to prevent invasions. Some have guns, but most of us just carry sticks, pipes, and torches. I never thought I'll ever do this, but we have no choice. There are no police, no soldiers. We block all intersections with our cars. Some of us will stand there. Others will do foot patrols. So it appears that South Africa is on the verge of collapse, but this is not a story of any interest to the New York Times. This is from a site called looserounds.com. South Africa could be on the verge of collapse, and all the warning signs are there. The looters have targeted foreign shops, shopping centers, distribution centers, and warehouses, and raided gun shops. Shortages are emerging in food, fuel, and ammo. Over 70 have reportedly been killed since social unrest began last week. I see that the death toll is supposedly now over 100. On Sunday, Saprev refinery near Durban, operated by Shell and BP, had shuttered operations due to civil unrest. There's also news that the country's top chicken and meat processor, Rainbow Chickens Limited, was raided by looters, which means widespread food shortages could be imminent. Pretty much all of the news I've been getting from South Africa has been from Twitter, with lots of horrifying videos. Yesterday, the Washington Post Had a guest column by someone called Eusebius McKaiser, who is described as a political analyst, author, and broadcaster based in Johannesburg. Over the past few weeks, he writes, scenes of looting and violent protests have emerged from South Africa following the jailing of former President Jacob Zuma. Yet it is a mistake to interpret what is unfolding as a sign of massive political support for Zuma. It is also an error to see the gross acts of criminality and theft as inexplicable. On the contrary, the scenes of violent destruction playing out in the provinces of Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal are the logical and foreseeable consequences of the moral decline and technocratic failure of the African National Congress-run state. These deeper roots of this week's violence should not be obscured with hasty moralizing about the antisocial behavior of people living on the margins of South African society. The imprisonment of Zulu is the proximate cause of long-haul trucks then being torched in KwaZulu-Natal, major roads being blocked, and the wanton looting of shopping malls and violent destruction of property. One of Zuma's sons, and he's said to have anywhere up to 20 of them, children, one of his sons said that, yes, looting, but make sure that it is responsible looting. I am not making this up. Even the rollout of COVID-19 vaccines had been disrupted. Oh dear, is that the worst thing that is happening in South Africa? As many healthcare workers are afraid to go to work, many venues dispensing vaccines closed their doors for fear of being looted. In some hospitals, oxygen shortages occurred because road closures made it impossible for oxygen to be delivered. You may have seen, if you've been on Twitter, a meme has been created which is Black people in South Africa picking up as much milk in cartons as they can and then dumping it on the ground. Eusebius continues, South Africa is therefore experiencing a serious economic, political, and compounded public health crisis. But the looting and protests are indicative of the failure of political leadership and an ANC government no longer fit for purpose. Yet the dominant narrative focusing on rampant crime is an oversight. More than 74% of youths under age 25 are jobless, while 43.2% of the entire population of potential workers do not have a job. Half of South Africans are chronically poor, and most neglected of all, the levels of asset and income inequality make this country one of the most economically unjust societies on earth, with a thin group of wealthy folks at the top, a precarious middle class of sorts, and a large, poor, asset-less base. Well, I'm going to be talking about Amy Chua's World on Fire tomorrow. And South Africa is a great example of a country with market-dominant minorities. You can say that there are two: whites, who are about 9% of the population, and Indians, that's dot, not feather, which are about similar amount of the population. And the Indians look like they could be in for very serious trouble. This essay in the Washington Post continues that everything that's happened does not mean government should not secure the state and arrest the lawless. It should. That is the first political duty of all states. But finger wagging in the direction of looters will not solve the problem. The solution will be found in answering two questions not being posed at present. What will South Africans do to eliminate all forms of inequality? And how long will South African voters continue to reward an ANC government that is not responsive to their needs? This is so very naive. South Africa is a one-party state, essentially, the African National Congress. It's a black party. And South Africans do not vote on the basis of, yes, I'm looking at the policies listed here, and I don't think they are quite up to snuff. I think I'll consider some other political parties. Eliminate all forms of inequality. Yes, make South Africa a totalitarian terrorist state. And that will certainly solve all their problems. But who is waiting in the wings? That would be the Economic Freedom Fighters, or the EFF. And their commander-in-chief, that's how he describes himself, on Twitter, is called Julius Sello Malema. On July the 12th, he tweeted, "No soldiers on our streets, otherwise we are joining. All fighters must be ready. They won't kill us all. We need a political solution to a political problem, not soldiers." And he retweeted, "As someone, hate EFF all you want, but stop trying to link it to the nonsense going on in the country right now. Don't be stupid." The EFF is, of course, notorious for its love of the song "Kill the Boers," but of course, prominent members of the ANC have also sung this song, including leaders of it. And this fellow Malema, he does not like the Indians. He does not like them at all. He retweeted something from someone called Advo Barry Rue, the Indian guy who was driving around in Phoenix shooting innocent black people for fun, was shot dead by another Indian who thought he was black. He was a pastor. Whether this happened or not, who knows? Who knows? Of course, Zuma was linked corruptly to the Gupta family, and this is the sort of thing that we see all over Africa. We were racially profiled on way to get food at a Spar in Durban North. All cars in front of us just drove through, and we were stopped. I suppose there's a possibility of genocide in South Africa. The Indians and the whites are getting it. Of course, if the Indians and the whites were to get it, there would be nothing left of South Africa. It would become another Zimbabwe. And I don't know, perhaps this is what these people want. So long as the people at the top get paid off, which is typically what happens in a minority market-dominated state, that the rest can go hang. The people in charge, the businessmen in charge, give us our cut. So life is good for us. You know, I can only conclude that the near blackout of news about South Africa is because the elite is scared. And they're also flexing their muscles. Where's the news about South Africa? South Africa? What are you talking about? Is something going on in South Africa? You're not interested in South Africa. Yes, but the elite, it was at one time very interested in South Africa because it was a shining example of our multicultural future. Perhaps the people who thought this think that all the blacks in Africa love each other. That is, of course, the opposite of the case. But the people who claim to be the saviors of foreign countries, particularly in Africa, know very little about it, typically. Here is a alarming, well, yes, it was, I saw a reference to a story from 2017. "I've worked with refugees for decades. Europe's Afghan crime wave is mind-boggling." This was from Cheryl Bernard in the National Interest. And this is another story which has been buried. In Germany, for instance, when migrants commit murders, the real problem is Islamophobia. And of course, this is a symptom of a dying society. And I'll have more on that later. So, Russiagate, it was all made up. It's one of the biggest scandals in American history, that the so-called intelligence community and the media and the Hillary Clinton campaign made up a bunch of lies about Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. And, oh, yes, Trump must be impeached because of this. And then when the impeachment indictment came down, there was nothing about Russia in it because it was all fake right from the very beginning. And James Comey knew about it from the beginning, and he lied under oath about it. But the media, not content with having destroyed any semblance of credibility it still had left, is back. It is back with Russiagate 2, which promises to be even more spectacular than the original one. As the book of Proverbs says, as a dog returneth to his vomit, so a fool returneth to his folly. This is a story by Luke Harding, Julian Borger, and Dan Sabag in The Guardian. Kremlin papers appear to show Putin's plot to put Trump in the White House. Exclusive documents suggest Russia launched secret multi-agency effort to interfere in U.S. democracy. Vladimir Putin personally authorized a secret spy agency operation to support a, quote, mentally unstable, unquote, Donald Trump in the 2016 U.S. presidential election during a closed session of Russia's National Security Council, according to what are assessed to be leaked Kremlin documents. The meeting took place on January 22nd, 2016. The paper suggests with the Russian president, his spy chiefs, and senior ministers all present. They agreed a Trump White House would help secure Moscow's strategic objectives, among them social turmoil in the U.S. and a weakening of the American president's negotiating position. Russia's 3 spy agencies were ordered to find practical ways to support Trump in a decree appearing to bear Putin's signatures. Western intelligence agencies are understood to have been aware of the documents for some months and to have carefully examined them. The papers seen by the Kremlin seem to represent a serious and highly unusual leak from within the Kremlin. Yes, highly unusual. The Guardian has shown the documents to independent experts who say they appear to be genuine. Incidental details come across as accurate. The overall tone and thrust is said to be consistent with Kremlin security thinking. The Kremlin responded dismissively. Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, said the idea that Russian leaders had met and agreed to support Trump in the meeting in early 2016 was a great pulp fiction when contacted by The Guardian on Thursday morning. Yes, it contains a brief psychological assessment of Trump, who is described as an impulsive, mentally unstable, and unbalanced individual who suffers from an inferiority complex. Yes, Trump's a loser. During the 2016 election and for 4 years after that, we were given 2 contradictory stories about Donald Trump at the same time. One, that he was a loser, a failure, a frequent bankrupt, a joke in the business community who lied about how much money he had. Nothing to worry about from this quarter. At the same time, we were told that Trump was a terrifying figure, a master of authoritarianism, a threat to everything that we hold near and dear. Well, pick one. Both of these cannot be true at the same time. Oh, let's see. The paper refers to certain events that happened during Trump's trips to Moscow. Security Council members are invited to find details in Appendix 5. At paragraph 5, the document states, it is unclear what the appendix contains. Yes, I've got a pretty good idea. We're back to the piss dossier. In more fake news, this is from 5 people at CNN. And of course, CNN was the leader in foisting the Russiagate hoax, the Steele dossier hoax on America and the world, and they are returning to their own vomit too. They're not going to fucking succeed. Top generals feared Trump would attempt a coup after election, according to new book. The top U.S. military officer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs General Mark Milley, was so shaken that then President Donald Trump and his allies might attempt a coup or take other dangerous or illegal measures after the November election that Milley and other top officials informally planned for different ways to stop Trump, according to excerpts from an upcoming book obtained by CNN. The book, from Pulitzer Prize-winning Washington Post reporters Carol Leonink and Philip Rooker, describes how Milley and other Joint Chiefs discuss a plan to resign one by one rather than carry out orders from Trump that they consider to be illegal, dangerous, or ill-advised. Oh, who's planning a coup now? It was a kind of Saturday night massacre in reverse, Leonig and Rucker wrote. The book, I Alone Can Fix It, is scheduled to be released next Tuesday and chronicles Trump's final year as president with a behind-the-scenes look at how senior administration officials in Trump's inner circle navigated his increasingly unhinged behavior after losing the 2020 election. All of these books are fake. Every single one of them is fake, and the Washington Post has been a CIA asset until the 1950s. And again, if you think this is hyperbole, look up Operation Mockingbird. Let's have a look at the chat. Hello to Head McNeck, Dan, Kontiki Roulette. Head McNeck says, nobody pushed the end of apartheid as hard as the Western media. They are hiding the body. Just so. Frothing Fanboy says, Sky News of Australia has good coverage. Well, thank you for that. Steve says, good evening. Some people are fundamentally incompatible with Western civilization. Head McNeck also endorses Sky News's coverage. Kontiki Roulette says, the phrase narrative unraveling springs to mind. Chogokin666 says, I'm going to South Africa for vacation. Anran responds that $600 will go far there. The $600 being, Biden bucks? Yes, don't loot oxygen, says Chogokin666. Look, to the great majority of people who live in South Africa, technology is magic. They have no understanding of how it works. And the same people who would steal or destroy oxygen supply are the same people who will be howling when they or their relatives can't get oxygen when they need it. In the same way, where did all the milk go? I recall a few years ago, not that long ago, a cabinet minister in charge of agriculture and fishing seemed to have no idea that foodstuffs, agriculture came out of the ground. You plant seeds and you water it, it's fertilize it, etc. Or that fish come from the ocean and have to be caught. He said, we don't have to worry about these kind of shortages. Just go to the supermarket. Again, I'm not making it up. And the vast majority of these people, including cabinet ministers, have no idea of the very basics of technologies, such as agriculture and fishing. Pretty simple technologies. Gamion asks, are they practicing the fine tradition of necklacing? Yes, you might remember Winnie Mandela, who became a heroine in her own right. And then there was some difficulty about repeated stories about her torturing boys and her support of necklacing. You hang a tire around someone's neck, you dose it with gasoline, and then set it ablaze. I agree. Finger wagging won't solve anything, says Gamion. And buffering. Oh, I'm sorry about that. I can't imagine why there would be buffering. Nelson Mandela divorced Winnie Mandela and voted and married again with the widow of the leader of another South African country. And they forget that the Africans were there before the Bantu and were themselves victims of British colonialism, says Chogokin 666. Yes, the Bantu, they moved rather far afield in Africa, didn't they? Anran says, Kevin, the media still has lots of credibility with many, many people. I wonder about that. I really do. Polls repeatedly show journalists as being the least respected in America, or close to it. Star Rover says a psychiatric hospital in Durban was looted of computers, refrigerators, microwave ovens, and chairs. And hello to Buddy. Metal Mike says he's a narcissist, but he's certainly a winner. That would be what reference to Putin. Metal Mike says, I wish mainstream anchors would say, and now in more fake news. Don Willis says, just when you thought 2016 Trump was a fluke a non-threat fool. 2021 arrives and they are still vigorously going after him. Caligula 138, yes, again, a rush and a push, and the land is ours. Enron says, I'll always love Putin for bringing his dog out when Angie Merkel was visiting. Hello to Clown Velt. Caligula 138 says, do you know that albino Africans hide gold in their heads? That's why they are hunted. Yes, I know this. I've seen videos. It's not just albinos, but white people wearing sheets or painting their face white or whatever. South African blacks are terrified, hideously terrified of ghosts. Enron says, could COVID have happened without masses of people believing the media? Yeah, that's a good question. Is it the media so much as the so-called experts or the regime experts? I think it is the latter, actually. And the media said, well, no, we don't have any opinions on this. We got opinions on everything else. We don't have any opinions on COVID. Here are the experts. And when the experts continually contradicted themselves, of Fauci, the World Health Organization, Dr. Theresa Tam of Canada, oh, that's not a flip-flop. The science is evolving. The science always evolves. Oh, it does. I thought it was carved in stone, because that's something else you've been telling us at the same time. Metal Mike says 70 million to change Dundas Street name in Toronto. Well, it's money well spent, isn't it? Hello to HK, what's this, Big or Hig? First time a viewer. And let's talk about something else now. Let's talk about JD Vance. A story in the New York Post by Selena Zito. How liberals turned on JD Vance, working class author of Hillbilly Elegy. This is datelined Middletown, Ohio. When JD Vance's blockbuster memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, first came out in the spring of 2016, it was celebrated as a coup d'oeil of an American group long abandoned by the national conversation, the white working class of the industrial Midwest and Appalachia. While Vance grew up here in this decaying Rust Belt town, he was also equally connected to the hills of eastern Kentucky, where he summered with his extended family. In his book, he detailed with brutal honesty how social isolation, poverty, and despair impacted his family and others in the region. Vance miraculously made it out, joined the Marines, and went on to graduate from Ohio State University and then Yale Law School. When his book was released, Donald Trump was about to secure the Republican nomination for president, and Vance was celebrated as the one person who could decode the white working class attachment to the brash candidate promising to make America great again. In a glowing 2016 review for the New York Times, Jennifer Senior wrote that Vance's combination of thoughtful inquiry and firsthand experience provided a civilized reference guide for an uncivilized election, and he's done so in a vocabulary intelligible to both Democrats and Republicans. Vance, who was occasionally critical of Trump, became a sought-after guest on the talk show circuit. Before Vance joined his show, MSNBC host Chris Hayes told his audience that Hillbilly Elegy is, quote, a really fantastic read. It's really eye-opening. It's a great piece of work. You should check it out, unquote. For months, the blue-check Twitterati couldn't get enough of him. Now fast forward 5 years and they want nothing to do with him. It started after Joe Biden was elected in November, and Vance began offering his candid thoughts on social media about what he calls woke capitalism and the border crisis, as well as big tech's collusion with the First Amendment, economic nationalism, and China's role in the pandemic. Suddenly, nearly everything he said was construed as some form of racism, and anyone taking a sympathetic look at the white working class was considered taboo. When the film version of Hillbilly Elegy came out on Netflix in November, critics slammed it. Yes, I have not seen the film, but I've seen some of the reviews, and they were almost universally savage. And it reminds me of what happened with the film Red Dawn. There must be some sort of political agenda here, I thought. Then talk started to circulate that Vance might run for the U.S. Senate in 2022 to fill the seat being vacated by retiring Ohio Senator Rob Portman. So far, Silicon Valley tycoon Peter Thiel has pumped $10 million into a super PAC backing Vance's theoretical run. In an interview with the Post, Vance would not yet confirm whether he is running, but one thing's for sure, if he runs, it will be as a Republican. And that has stirred the ire of his former progressive fans. Greg Sargent in the Washington Post dismissed his positions as performance populism. Well, of course, the people at the Washington Post don't believe that there's any such thing as populism. Once it became clear that I was more on the side of Trump and the conservatives than I was on the side of the left, it went pretty hard, Vance said. Before Trump was elected, people were trying to understand the forgotten man, the white working class, however you want to put it. After Trump won, it quickly became one of two things. Either these voters are all racists or Russia hacked the election. The whole culture of the media has shifted from let's try to understand the other half of the country to let's just beat up on the other half of the country. Vance recalls doing an interview with Don Lemon on CNN before the election and the host expressing compassion and curiosity. He was trying to think through all of the problems that my family have gone through over the last couple of decades. After the election, Lemon invited Vance back onto a show and said every question was, how could these people still be behind Trump? Steve McMahon, a legendary DC-based Democratic strategist, aka political hack, says Vance demonstrated something in his uniquely American success story. He showed it's still possible in America to pull yourself up from adversity and be successful. But once you go from being an apolitical American success story to a politician, you immediately inherit all the enemies of your enemies. It's the partisan environment we've created. McMahon wishes Vance's story ended with him being a Democrat. Yeah, okay. His story is the story of many Democrats I know. Frankly, it's the story of too few Republicans. Well, McMahon apparently wanted Vance to become another hicklib. I don't want to talk about where I came from anymore. It's too disgusting. The people are disgusting. But here in Washington, D.C., or in Manhattan or Brooklyn, the people are absolutely delightful. And I've learned to appreciate the benefits of diversity and the deep state. Let's hear from Major Tom Nichols, anti-Trumper supreme, who practically foams at the mouth when he talks about Trump's voters. He's come pretty close to advocating for the old kind of voter laws. Prove you can read. Oh, if you don't have a bachelor's degree, you can't vote. That sort of thing. Why are these people in Heartland America suffering? Well, Tom Nichols' position can pretty much be reduced to because they're scum and they deserve it. What do we call a man? Oh, let's go to the headline first. The moral collapse of JD Vance. Instead of a truth teller in his own community, Vance's candidate has become a contemptible and cringe-inducing clown. Okay, let's go, Major Tom. What do we call a man who turns on everything he once claimed to believe? For a practitioner of petty and self-serving duplicity, we use sellout or backstabber. Sometimes we impugn the animal kingdom and call him a rat, a skunk, or a weasel. For grand betrayals of weightier loyalties, country and faith, we invoke the more solemn terms of traitor or apostate. Yes, tell us how you really feel, Major Tom. But what should we call a JD Vance? The self-described hillbilly turned Marine, turned Ivy League law school graduate, turned venture capitalist, turned Senate candidate. Words fail. Yeah, but you're going to keep going for several hundred or several thousand, aren't you, Major Tom? His perfidy to his own people in Ohio is too big to allow him to escape with the level of opportunist, and yet the shabbiness and absurdity of his Senate campaign is too small to brand him as a defector or a heretic. My friend, Preet Bharara, the former U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, tried to describe Vance recently and came up with pathetic loser, poser, fake jerk. Yes, you see, Vance is not a Brahmin like Preet Bharara, so that makes him a loser. How are you liking your market-dominating minorities now? America? To distill the essence of Vance as a public figure, The word that enters my mind, says Major Tom, is an anatomical reference beginning with the letter A. I do not use that word lightly or comfortably. I am in the formal sense of man of letters. Ooh, he's a man of letters. No, what he is, to use a phrase beloved by Muriel Spark, is a pisser de copy. I've been an officer of instruction at several institutions of higher education, and I remind you here that I do not represent any of them and speak only for myself. I would not advise my students to use the term, but the word is apt when I consider Vance's silly and yet detestable moral collapse. Some people back in Vance's home region of Appalachia thought his memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, was hollow and inaccurate, but for a time, other people, including me, were intrigued by his writing and public speaking. Vance lived as a child in a steel town in Ohio and spent his summers in the hills of eastern Kentucky. Well, I grew up amid the rotting factories of New England, solidly in the working class, but not poor. I welcomed his willingness to cast a critical eye on his and my people, especially after years of conservative hand-wringing, focused solely on the dysfunction of minority communities. Yeah, this is the problem that Major Tom has with JD Vance, is that Vance has not become a hicklib like Major Tom. You can see here that the elite is terrified of Vance. That oh my God, Rob Portman is a reliable agent of the regime in Ohio, and he might be replaced by someone who is not a creep. Oh, he speaks of his hypocrisy, which makes him indistinguishable from other figures in American politics, such as Senators Tom Cotton and Josh Hawley, who are products of privilege and elite education, and who now pretend to be the tribunes of the forgotten people. I wonder if Major Tom, who probably considers himself a historian, has ever heard of Julius Caesar? Who came from one of the great Roman gens and also became the tribune of the forgotten people. And, okay, oh, yes. Is the end near? This is from Stacy Liberatore at the Daily Mail. In 1972, a team at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology predicted that humanity's pursuit of economic growth, without regard for environmental and society costs, or societal as one might write, would lead to society collapsing by the mid-21st century. A new study finds this may become a reality. Gaia Harrington, Sustainability and Dynamic System Analysis Lead at KPMG, undertook the task of proving or disproving MIT's claims and used a world simulation model that analyzed how our world has progressed from 1972. Harrington looked at 10 key variables such as population, industrial output, and persistent pollution, and determined our business as usual mentality will spark a decline of economic growth within the next decade. However, the data revealed an even bleaker future. Our world could experience a total societal collapse by 2040. A total societal collapse would mean an abrupt decline in quality of life, food production, industrial output, and ultimately the human population. MIT made its prediction using a computer program called World One and looked back as far as 1900 and all the way up to 2060. The data was produced on long sheets of white paper and appeared as graph lines. In a video of the 1972 findings, MIT's Jerry Foster, who developed World One, revealed his innovation of the world and used MIT's works to do so. Foster showed how population has increased from 1900 to the turn of the century. The line starts out low and then keeps climbing until a few years after 2000, when it then petered out. Other examples he used was quality of life, which increased rapidly up until the 1940s and then diminished until 2020, when it sees another uptick. So quality of life increased rapidly until the 1940s and then diminished until 2020. Well, certainly in the Western world, quality of life soared after World War II. The model identified 2020 as a tipping point for civilization. At around 2020, the condition of the planet becomes highly critical. If we do nothing about it, the quality of life goes down to zero, Foster said in a 1973 ABC segment. Pollution becomes so serious it will start to kill people, which in turn will cause the population to diminish lower than it was in the 1900s. At this stage, around 2040 to 2050, civilized life as we know it on this planet will cease to exist. Pollution is much less of a problem than it is in the Western world than it was up to the 1960s. In the 1960s, there was something of a hysteria about pollution, air pollution, water pollution, ground pollution, and very serious steps were taken to curb this pollution, leading to a much better world for the people who live in it. Of course, in Asia, and in Africa, and other places, they don't really care much about this sort of thing. But we don't live in Asia or Africa, do we? For all the obsessive hatred of plastic, plastic is choking our oceans. Where's this plastic coming from? It's coming, what, 90% or more from something like 8 or 9 rivers in Asia. They don't, the people of the Indian subcontinent in China, they don't really have much concern with what we call the common weal. And by the way, carbon dioxide is not a pollutant. It is, in fact, as I was taught in school, and perhaps you were too, the building block of life, the sine qua non of life on Earth. But this declinism reminds me of Joseph Tainter, whose book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, which was published in 1988. I spoke about, a couple of years ago on the old book club. I'll read here a summary from Wikipedia. According to Tainter's Collapse of Complex Societies, societies become more complex as they try to solve problems. Social complexity can be recognized by numerous differentiated and specialized social and economic roles, and many mechanisms through which they are coordinated, and by reliance on symbolic and abstract communication, and the existence of a class of information producers and analysts who are not involved in primary resource production. Such complexity requires a substantial energy subsidy, meaning the consumption of resources or other forms of wealth. When a society confronts a problem, such as a shortage of energy or difficulty in gaining access to it, it tends to create new layers of bureaucracy, infrastructure, or social class to address the challenge. Tainter, who first identifies 17 examples of rapid collapse of societies, applies his model to 3 case studies: the Western Roman Empire, the Maya civilization, and the Chaco culture. For example, as Roman agricultural output slowly declined and population increased, per capita energy availability dropped. The Romans solved this problem by conquering their neighbors to appropriate their energy supplies as metals, grain, slaves, and other materials of value. However, as the empire grew, the cost of maintaining communications, garrisons, civil government, etc. grew with it. Eventually, this cost grew so great that any new challenges, such as invasions and crop failures, could not be solved by the acquisition of more territory. Intense authoritarian efforts to maintain cohesion by Domitian and Constantine the Great only led to an even greater strain on the population. The empire was split into 2 halves, of which the western soon fragmented into smaller units. The eastern half, being wealthier, was able to survive longer and did not collapse, but instead succumbed slowly at piecemeal, because unlike the Western Empire, it had powerful neighbors able to take advantage of its weakness. It is often assumed that the collapse of the Western Roman Empire was a catastrophe for everyone involved. Tainter points out that it can be seen as a very rational preference of individuals at the time, many of whom were actually better off. Tainter notes that in the West, local populations in many cases greeted the barbarians as liberators. Tainter begins by categorizing and examining the often inconsistent explanations that have been offered for collapse in the literature. In Tainter's view, while invasions, crop failures, disease, or environmental degradation may be the apparent causes of societal collapse, the ultimate cause is an economic one inherent in the structure of society rather than internal shocks which may batter them, diminishing returns on investment in social complexity. Finally, Tainter musters modern statistics to show that marginal returns on investment in energy, education, and technological innovation are diminishing today. The globalized modern world is subject to many of the same stresses that brought older societies to ruin. Well, let's look at what's been going on in the West. for several decades. The problem of scale. And, well, one aspect of the problem of scale is multiculturalism. And multiculturalism is hailed as a tremendous benefit. Exactly how it's a tremendous benefit is never made clear. But one practical result of multiculturalism has been a huge expanse in bureaucracy, that the government hires more and more and more people, usually at very high costs, in order to deal with self-inflicted problems. Oh, so it turns out that these people in multicultural societies don't like each other too much, and they say mean things. So we'll need to hire more and more bureaucrats and start arresting people who say mean things. You can see what's happened in the universities. The proportion of bureaucrats to professors grows ever higher. And how much are people actually learning in universities anymore? That's not the point. The point is the certificate. And a bachelor's degree, that's not sufficient anymore. You need a master's degree, or maybe you need a PhD. It's just diminishing returns on investments in social complexity. Of course, if you look at the computer revolution, where are we now with the computer revolution? It's been estimated that the economic benefits from this, well, they didn't increase. And this goes back several decades. Oh, yes, our phones, smartphones get better and better and better. And that is, how is that really much of a benefit? I mean, I could go on about this. I don't think that it is going to be a pollution that leads to any possible collapse. Simply a failure of the leadership class to understand how ever-increasing complexity and ever-increasing and failing attempts at central control overburden the system until it collapses. I mentioned briefly this article from 2017 about Afghan migrants in Europe. What kind of insane country or countries would invite millions of people whose view of women, just to give one example, is almost homicidal in its hatred? And of course, oh, yes, we need to hire more police and more social workers and build more prison cells and hire more bureaucrats to monitor those Germans who say mean things about migrants. None of this is productive. All of it is parasitical. That, increasingly, when one looks at the allocation of resources in the West, it becomes more and more parasitical. Nothing useful is produced. Let's go to the chat. Selena Zito was bashing Trump and Trump voters until he won, then billed herself to be the Rust Belt whisperer, says Half Galician. Well, that's the way of the world. You need the trimmers. Every successful movement has the true believers, those who were there at the beginning, but mostly trimmers. I want to be on the winning side. Don Willis says people lie all the time because lots of people benefit from lying. John S. says, KMG, you should interview Borzoi John Chapman about the world model. He's very deeply into these graphs. I reviewed his book, Cultured Grugs, a few weeks ago. Clownvelt says, I would love to hear you speak more about declinism. I think I've got a touch of that myself. Well, here's another example of this. Let's shift, manufacturing and other jobs to China and Asian countries. And so the people in Heartland don't have jobs anymore. And of course, anybody with any brains gets the hell out and moves, to New York, Boston, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, San Francisco, Los Angeles, etc. And so America, the middle of it, hollowed out. How does this make any kind of economic sense? How does this make any kind of societal sense? It benefits the oligarchy. And the oligarchy feels no obligation to people who are outside the oligarchy. I would like to hear Kevin give Tainter's book a more thorough treatment like he's been giving the Serval State. Actually, that's a very good idea, John S. Thank you for that. Are seagulls a problem? Shake KMG, ask Palpcasso 88. They are numerous and exceedingly noisy. I don't really have any other complaints against them. It wasn't quality of life which soared after World War II. It was standard of living. Okay, well, yes, we can argue about that. I have a problem with writers who equate, quality of life with standard of living. But these two things have been thoroughly conflated. Neville Hodgkinson is certainly worth a look concerning these febrile times, says Clown Velt. Neville Hodgkinson. Okay, well, I will look into that. And moving on, just a second here. Got to open something from Twitter, which is difficult to do from Microsoft Word for reasons I don't understand. Oh, yes. Speaking about declinism, speaking about collapse, a fascinating tweet storm from someone who calls himself or herself Anglo Distruster 40K at TINKZORG. The realization that North Korea is just as bad or worse than most people think it is, while simultaneously being less of an inhuman dystopian nightmare than South Korea, is probably the single most depressing black pill I've had the displeasure of swallowing. North Korea, poor, mountainous, authoritarian shithole. You're basically living in Asian Albania. South Korea, birth rates are permanently below levels otherwise only seen during acute famines. Students work more than interns in Soviet labor camps. This is somehow seen as normal. South Korea is basically all the worst parts of the West, except that instead of having a 200-year run-up, the destruction of the old culture and social mores took place within the span of a single generation. It's basically Western capitalism's own Soviet Union experiment. The Soviet Union during the tail end of Stalinist collectivization, so when people started to have some food to eat again, was probably less insane and anti-human than what passes for normality in South Korea today for students. And that is not some sort of defense of Stalinism. Japan, which Westerners love to gripe about as the basket case of low fertility, has a birth rate of 1.42. South Korea has just dropped to 0.98. NORCs are at 1.9. Would you rather live in the IRL version of Children of Men and buy Funko Pops, or have a family in Albania? Parents are expected to pay astronomical sums for private education for their kids to have a chance to compete in South Korea. Cram schools close near midnight. Kids are routinely sleep deprived throughout their childhood in order to have them study more. And there's a response here from PCSV. Someone once pointed out to me that South Korea is Japan, but even more so. And from Lionel Johnson, South Korea's national motto should be anything worth doing is worth overdoing. Lived there once. B. Palmer responds, I once worked as a teacher in Korea, and it really is awful for kids and families. Even without kids, the familiar social hierarchy where adult children are expected to support their parents is crushing for ordinary people. Almost everyone with money leaves Korea for North America. Someone called Lim responded, sort of idiotic to fixate this much on birth rates as the indicator of a good or bad country. Anglo Disruptor 40K responded, a good country to live in will generally not lose 60% of its entire population per generational turnover. LOL. Yes, I guess what we see, you can see, if you see that film Parasite, you get some sort of indication of this. Overproduction of elites. And, going back to Tainter, just the expenditure of energy, more and more energy, it doesn't even prop up the system anymore. The system declines. Everyone is not going to be a top scholar. Oh, well, yes, they go to school for X number of hours a week, but then spend more time than that in extra study. Oh, yes, I suppose people boast there, oh, I don't go to bed, I study until 11, till 12, till 1, and there's no end to that. But what is the point? Clearly, a society that has stopped having children, it's about to lose 60% of its population in a generation, is a society that has given up on the future. I'd be curious for the chat to chime in on this and tell me what they think of what Anglo Distruster 40K had to say. Caligula 138 says, I just got a few books in the mail. Peak Oil, Volume 1, Peak of Philosophy, and the Ontology of Limitation by Chad A. Haag. Head McNeck says, hey now, Albania is quite pleasant. John S. says, this sounds like an interview I just heard with some dude called Tinksorg. Yes, indeed. Too many smart people in South Korea, says no use. John S. says, look up Good Old Boys, boys with a Z, in your favorite podcast app. No Use likes the film A Parasite. John S. says they talk specifically about elite overproduction. The sister from Parasite is the only Asian woman. Oh, okay. Head McNeck likes the sister in Parasite. No, I found her an attractive woman as well. Kontiki Roulette says, all the McDonald's in Singapore were filled with school kids with their heads in their homework. The national norm is to excel academically. Well, it reminds me of the joke from Garrison Keillor, how he introduced the Prairie Home Companion? He talked about the town where it's set, where all the children are above average. He's making a joke about the old Minnesota, a Scandinavian and German striver society. But South Korea seems to have taken this to an absolutely insane level, whereas Minnesota has now devolved to worship of St. George Floyd. Oh, evidence of collapse. Here we go. This is from Fox 45 News. Baltimore City Schools has reached an alarming low in student performance. Project Baltimore has learned during the first 3 quarters of the year, nearly half of high school students in city schools earned a grade point average below a D. How about that? What was this fellow, Griff de Leon? He did some work on this some years ago, and based on publicly available statistics, estimated that the average IQ of blacks in Baltimore had fallen to something like 72, whereas the average IQ of whites in Baltimore had fallen to 86. Of course, this is the result of dysgenic breeding, where the stupidest people mate with each other over and over again, whereas those with intelligence have stopped breeding for the most part. Because it cuts down on one's choices and leaves one with less pocket money. Also, having children, actually birthing children, is increasingly seen by the elite as infra-dig and even disgusting, as in Huxley's novel Brave New World. And just hang on a second here. Something else from Twitter. And here we go. Okay. A society that has decided to kill itself. Jean Swanson. Now, this woman has been, she's now a Vancouver City Councillor. She has been a public nuisance in Vancouver, where I lived most of my life for, since forever. Since what, the 1960s? And she tweets I got to hand out safe drugs today with Vandu and DULF. 6 deaths a day from poison drugs is way too many. 1 is too many. Safe supply now. And she's holding up one of these little boxes, which they hand out all over Victoria, including across the street. Warning, this box contains heroin, which is a highly addictive substance. Why, thank you for that. It's good to know that heroin is a highly addictive substance. So we have people dying of drug overdoses, and the solution is to give them high-quality, free heroin. To read Theodore Dalrymple on the subject, which I recommend, the myth is that people become criminals in order to support their heroin habit. As it turns out, most heroin addicts were criminals before they started using heroin. But we all love the junkies now. We just all love the junkies, because what could go wrong with tolerating or even encouraging people to become addicted to drugs such as heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, fentanyl, etc. And in more clown world from Canada, this is from Rachel Brady. At the Globe and Mail, as an Olympic canoeist and her parent head to Tokyo, both are fulfilling lifelong dreams and breaking barriers. And there is a picture of a young woman on the left with blonde hair who is wearing a white t-shirt that says Canada on it. And then to her right, there is a picture of an extraordinary creature who apparently is a woman. The schnoz on this person, as well as the massive jaw, give it away right from the very beginning. Haley Daniels and her dad are in the midst of fulfilling lifelong dreams. The daughter's to be an Olympian, and the father's to live as a woman. This month in Tokyo, Daniels will be among the first wave of women competing in Olympic canoeing, an event that had previously been open only to men. Boo. The person she's always known as her father will also be at the Games, officiating in that same Olympic sport. Both parent and daughter will be blazing trails in Tokyo. Ms. Daniels lobbied for years to get women's canoe into the Olympics. The 30-year-old from Calgary will compete in the adrenaline-pumping sea ice slalom, paddling on an artificial whitewater course in Japan, passing through the gates while navigating fast-moving spirals in a race against the clock. Ms. Daniels is also celebrating her father, who recently transitioned and now lives as a transgender woman called Kimberly Daniels. Kimberly, a longtime gate judge in canoe slalom, who has officiated many international competitions from World Championships to the 2016 Rio Olympics, is believed to be one of the game's first transgender officials. Will wonders never cease? Family members are permitted to judge at the games. That just seems stupid. But Canada, still a world beater. The days of Canadian greatness are definitely not over. This is from Tita Smith from the Daily Mail, Australia. Hundreds of protesters have stormed Melbourne's CBD to rally against the looming 5-day lockdown coming into force across Victoria at midnight. Premier Daniel Andrews Thursday said Victoria had no choice but to enter a snap statewide lockdown to contain a growing outbreak of the COVID-19 Delta variant. The decision came after the state recorded 2 new cases, bringing its cluster to 18. That's this many. 5, 10, 15, 18. Yeah, I know. It's apocalyptic stuff. Bringing its cluster to 18, which was sparked when New South Wales's outbreak was imported into Melbourne by a Sydney removalist working interstate. But hundreds of angry residents did not agree with the Premier, demanding he be sacked for plunging the state into its 5th lockdown since the pandemic began in March 2020. And again, there seems to be a contest. It goes back and forth between Canada and Australia as to which is the most effeminate country in the Anglosphere. Right? It seems to me that Australia has pulled ahead. But Canada, Don't count us out. We may surprise you. Let's go to lockdown skeptics. Infections are peaking nationwide as they fall in the unvaccinated, says Professor Tim Spector. Reported, this is for what England and Wales. Reported causative COVID tests hit a new recent high yesterday, confirming for many that their fears of a big exit wave are coming to pass. However, Tim Spector, a lead scientist on the Zoe COVID study app and professor of genetic epidemiology at King's College London, had another message that, according to his data, infections are already peaking. What's behind the COVID surge in the Netherlands? The Netherlands has been in the news this week after Prime Minister Mark Rutte apologized for reopening nightclubs at the end of June following a surge in infections that came in the following 2 weeks. Rutte has now closed them again for a month amid allegations that he made a criminal choice and put people in danger. The rise in positive tests certainly looks alarming, though note the past 4 days has seen a slowdown. Open a window. How many are dying because this is still the best treatment the NHS offers to those suffering with COVID-19 at home? The highly recommended Heart Bulletin this week has a piece on how the NHS is failing COVID patients by not offering any adequate early treatment, despite the now plentiful evidence of the clinical effectiveness of a number of safe repurposed drugs, none of which I'm going to name here because I will be instantly locked out of YouTube forever. Yes, fresh air is good. Fresh air. Also sunshine. I suppose if you can't get sunshine for some reason, you can use vitamin D. Ipsos Mori poll showing large support for permanent restrictions far off the mark, new data suggests. A new polling organization, Prolific, has taken it upon itself to challenge recent polling by Ipsos Mori that suggested a surprisingly high percentage of Brits believe certain lockdown restrictions should stay in place permanently. Prolific believed that if the questions asked by Ipsos Mori were changed slightly, the results would come out very differently. How right it was. The results of its own poll have been published in the Financial Times. And yes, they are very different indeed. And this is the secret of polling, that if you ask a question in the right way, you can always get the response you want. In what circumstances are lockdowns justified? Asked Dr. David McGrogan, an associate professor of law at Northumbria Law School, asking whether the state is ever justified in imposing a lockdown. McGrogan thinks it might be justifiable in certain limited circumstances, but those haven't arisen over the past 16 months and are unlikely to rise in the near future. Sainsbury's and Tesco to continue telling customers to wear face masks after Freedom Day. Yes, it appears Freedom Day for England and Wales, which is July the 19th. There's not going to be much freedom there. Norwich Pub becomes first in Britain to announce vaccine passport checks for punters. Philip Cutter, the landlord of the Gardener's Arms, decided to introduce vaccine checks after 2 of his 25 bar staff tested positive for COVID, forcing him to shut for 10 days, according to reports. He also appears to have been egged on by Public Health England, which warned against relying on people being honest when submitting COVID test results to show at the door. More than 500,000 people in England pinged by Test and Trace app in just 1 week. Given the number of people being pinged by Test and Trace, it is no wonder that so many are deleting the NHS COVID app or never bothered downloading it in the first place. The latest figures show that in just 1 week, more than 500,000 people in England alone were told they needed to self-isolate after coming into contact with someone who tested positive for COVID. This suggests that people are less afraid of COVID than the experts and the media would have us believe. A Manchester mother is demanding an apology from local police force for sending officers in a riot van to check that her 12-year-old daughter was self-isolating. The young girl was left petrified after officers shouted through the house to see if she'd been following the rules, according to her mother. The home was visited twice, leading the girl to believe she was going to get arrested at any moment. And let's go to Alex Berenson, as we always do. And, okay, getting easier to list what I'm not. Not a conservative, not an activist, not COVID vaccinated, not on the Fox News payroll. What I am, a reporter trying to get information, unreported truths, let's say to you, whether or not you choose to pay me. Oh, here's something interesting from the Washington Post. Biden's top doctor nominee made more than $2 million doing pandemic consulting speeches. Tapped to be Surgeon General Vivek Murthy's financial entanglements drew scrutiny before his Senate confirmation hearing on Thursday. Berenson comments, if it is not completely obvious by now, government officials should not be working in concert with private companies to ban information they do not like. Yes, well, COVID has been lucrative for some people. The U.S. Surgeon General calls COVID misinformation an urgent threat. Health misinformation about social distancing, mask use, treatments, and vaccines has been rampant during the coronavirus pandemic, according to the New York Times. Berenson comments, Murthy says social media companies not doing enough to stop posts about all the money he made consulting about COVID with Airbnb. Look it up, kids. It's a fact. Yes. And there's more on the fading efficacy of vaccines, which you can find at Berenson's Twitter feed. And I'm going to talk now about residential schools. Still 55 hectares to be surveyed at Kamloops Residential School before total number of unmarked graves is known. A specialist in ground penetrating radar says there are nearly 650,000 square meters of land to be surveyed before the total number of unmarked graves is confirmed at the site of Canada's largest residential school. Sarah Beaulieu, a professor at the University of the Fraser Valley, released her initial findings from the site in BC's interior during a news conference Thursday hosted by the Kamloops First Nation. Her search of an area on the grounds there identified 200 of what she called remaining targets of interest, which may be graves. Thank you, CTV News, for saying out loud what I've been saying since May the 28th, which may be graves. Beaulieu said it can be challenging to know whether it is a grave prior to exhumation when there is no casket, but there's not going to be any exhumation because the Kamloops Indian Band has already said that it would be disrespectful to do so. The area searched once held an apple orchard and was chosen for the initial search in part because of the discovery of a child's rib bone. Additionally, survivors of schools described children as young as 6 being woken up during the night and asked to dig graves in the orchard. I can state with almost 100% certainty that that never happened. If you're looking to dig graves, you don't want children to do it. Also, if these are supposedly shameful deaths, even murders, why would you get the children involved in covering up the evidence? This story becomes increasingly more stupid and more outlandish. But there we go. Oh, here's a story from my old colleague and friend, Kelly Jane Torrance, who is now at the New York Post. U.S. media shamefully justified a string of Canadian church burnings. One day this month in Canada, 10 Catholic churches were vandalized in a single city, Calgary. In the last month, arsonists and vandals have attacked dozens of Canadian churches, burning some entirely to the ground. And there's a bunch of the usual stuff about the horrible forced assimilation policy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is all a de rigueur, you know. It's got to be in all the stories. Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission concluded in 2015 that at least 3,200 students died, later revising that figure to 4,100. The number one cause of death was tuberculosis. Influenza hit hard, too. Far from home, children were often buried on site, their graves marked with wooden crosses, most of which deteriorated and disappeared. The U.S. press has treated the news as if Canada had been hiding genocidal death camps. All the headlines are false. According to all three chiefs who made the discoveries, this is not a mass grave site. This is just unmarked graves. Cowessess First Nation Chief Cadmus Delorme said of the biggest site. Indeed, the remains aren't even believed to be all of children. A band leader said the site was a community cemetery, including graves of non-Indigenous people, unmarked because the wooden markers had decomposed. So it appears there's pretty much no story here at all. So what's going on? What's going on in my country? Well, the elite has an idea. The elite has an idea that they are going to gain more power and wealth by destroying Canada as it has already existed. Let's hear next from a PR spiv called Robin V. Sears, who's associated with the NDP party, and I believe now runs his own PR spiv shop. This piece appeared today in Policy Magazine, Canadian Politics and Public Policy, which is, how shall I say, a semi-official organ of the Canadian government. Truth must come before reconciliation. I want to know who killed my grandmother's children. I want to know who led the schools where these atrocities took place. These are among the so far unanswered questions posed by second and third generation survivors of Canada's brutal, racist residential school system. As the number of victims' unmarked graves now numbers in the thousands, they are questions Canada can no longer ignore. There are, living in quiet retirement across Canada, hundreds of former teachers, principals, Indian agents, bureaucrats, and the Catholic Church's nuns, priests, and church officials who are at least complicit in this appalling Canadian chapter. Blah, blah, blah. Oh, yes, South Africa, truth and reconciliation. So we're into epigenetics now, are we? Before I talk about that, Sears' story was lauded by a fellow called L. Ian MacDonald, who was a big deal in the Canadian elite, and I believe I'm related to by marriage. MacDonald was started off in journalism. He wrote a fawning biography of Brian Mulroney in 1984, then served as chief speechwriter for Mulroney from 1985 to 88. He served as Minister of Public Affairs at the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C. from 1992 to 94. So he is identified as being on the right, as a conservative, but he has the same opinions on wrecking Canada as Robin Sears does, because the Canadian elite has decided, all of it, that Canada as traditionally constituted must be destroyed. But you're asking, what about epigenetics? Well, you see, Canada had a Holocaust and Canada had a genocide. And since Canada had a genocide, we get epigenetics. Epigenetic transmission of Holocaust trauma. This is from the National Library of Medicine. The Holocaust left its visible and invisible marks not only on the survivors, but also on their children. Instead of numbers tattooed on their forearms, however, they may have been marked epigenetically with a chemical coating upon their chromosomes, which would represent a kind of biological memory of what the parents experienced. As a result, some suffer from a general vulnerability to stress, while others are more resilient. Previous research assumed that such transmission was caused by environmental factors, such as the parents' child-rearing behavior. New research, however, this is absolute nonsense. Absolute nonsense. Presumably, then, this wouldn't apply just to people whose, say, parents or other relatives perished in the Holocaust. Wouldn't it also apply to Allied soldiers, dying, fighting Hitler? That wouldn't their children, and perhaps their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, also suffer the crippling effects from their ancestors' death in battle? How about those who died fighting Hitler? I mean, who were tortured and killed? Would their offspring to the second and third generation also suffer this genetic impairment. It is just damnable nonsense. Someone called Wab Kinew, that's his actual name, Wab Kinew, is in the news for his brave stand against Premier Brian Pallister of Manitoba. And I looked at his Wikipedia entry and all of the nasty stuff about his career as a rapper. Yes, the Indians have rappers too. It's been scrubbed from Wikipedia. It's all been scrubbed. And apparently, isn't that supposed to be the greatest sin there is? Well, his career is chock full of it. There's a pretty funny story from CBC 2 years ago. Offensive. Brian Pallister under fire for saying Wab Kinew was handed more benefits than any premier. Pallister was referring to a recent study that found 56% of Manitoba families have less than $200 a month to spend after bills are paid. That's where I come from, Pallister said. Kinew does not come from a household like that. Kinew's narrative is that he was hard done by and he's on a road to recovery. The house he grew up in was triple the size of the one I was raised in, and mine didn't have any indoor plumbing. We might have had spoons in our house, but they were not silver. Kinew didn't go to a public school. He went to a private school. Kinew was handed more benefits than any premier in the last 60 years in the province. That's the truth. Offensive. So very offensive. I believe his comments are offensive on the basis that the premier should have a better understanding of the historical discrimination that we as Indigenous people have endured for generations, said consultant Derek Nepinak, who is the former Grand Chief of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. When we hear the word benefits, what it's tied to is what I believe to be a false narrative about Indigenous people receiving benefits from being identified as status Indians or government programs and services. It ties into a language that I think is a discourse to me that is somewhat racially motivated. Oh, so Indians get gibs on the basis solely that they're Indians, but to point this out would be racially motivated. Yeah, that's my country in a nutshell. And I was talking yesterday about, well, I'll repeat it again. You know, you can have a society based on racial justice, or you can have civilization. Pick one, because you can't have both. Gary Oliver writes in Conservative Woman, the Times columnist and conservative peer, Danny Finkelstein, has warned the party he nominally represents, you can enter into culture war if you like, but don't be too confident you will win it. One thing is for sure, in any cultural conflict, Lord Finkelstein, ennobled in 2013 as part of David Cameron's chumocracy, will not be on the side of social conservatism, nor indeed has been any recent incarnation of the Conservative Party. During recent decades, the country has ratcheted to the left, both socially and culturally, every time the Conservative Party has been either a spineless spectator or an enthusiastic endorser. When political opponents accuse Tories of waging a culture war, it means only that for the moment the left is not being allowed to advance as quickly as it wishes, and any conservative resistance will be tokenistic, timorous, and temporary. A case in point is this week's onslaught against Priti Patel, who last month dared to criticize as gesture politics footballers taking the knee. She further opined that if supporters chose to boo the gesture, as distinct from barracking the players, that's a choice for them, frankly. After one England player directly accused Patel of having stoked the fire of racism, Danny Finkelstein wrote, in the contest between the Home Secretary and Tyrone Mings, there will only be one winner and it won't be the politician. But even if this is the case, it does not invalidate her critique. Contrary to Finkelstein's straw man, no one is accusing the England team of being dangerous left-wing revolutionaries. Nonetheless, it was professional footballers who last year introduced into the UK the divisive ritual of taking the knee. They mimicked a gesture which at the time was associated with violent leftist activism in the United States, appropriated as a slogan Black Lives Matter, and copied the Marxist and anti-Semitic group's iconography of a clenched black fist. Britons then saw our own Black Lives Matter, ordering people to kneel, later attacking them and vandalizing both the cenotaph and Churchill's statue. Yet cod conservative Danny Finkelstein asserts, based upon nothing more than supposition and a prejudiced view of football supporters, that, quote, the jeering was racial abuse wearing the clothes of political argument, unquote, and criticizes the Home Secretary for not having kept stum about the country's footballers adopting such a divisive gesture. More predictably, Labour's Angela Rayner, who I will point out is quite possible might become Britain's first chav prime minister. Angela Rayner spent much of Monday sending a series of toxic tweets, including the nonsensical allegation that a Home Secretary of Ugandan Indian descent is on the same side as the racists. The commentator who has done most to defend Priti Patel against rancorous Rayner and other mudslingers is Tim Montgomery, normally the epitome of conciliatory conservatism. Under the circumstances, most conservatives kept their heads down, so hats off to Tim for continuing to announce that he shares the Home Secretary's disdain for Black Lives Matter and still disapproves of footballers taking the knee. On Tuesday's Politics Live, Montgomery was justifiably enraged by Diane Abbott's malevolent drivel. Fellow guest Ed Vasey, another cowardly conservative in the Lords, has the same don't make waves attitude as Danny Finkelstein. Well, that's what conservatives do. They mediate the victories of the left. And if that means dismantling your countries, and if it means dispossessing the people who built those countries, so be it. Because people like Danny will always find a way to benefit. Is a piece from 2016 by Steer Pike in the London Spectator, which is pretty amusing. There's a great scoop in the Times today. A political columnist, former chief leader writer of a national newspaper, was, unbeknown to readers, acting as David Cameron's chief stenographer for 6 years. In his columns, he'd present himself as a former Tory official, retired and out of action, full of self-deprecating anecdotes about what happened back in the day when he was working for William Hague. What he failed to disclose was that in between writing opinion pieces for his newspaper and acting as its executive editor, he was scurrying off to Downing Street to take dictation for the Prime Minister on a monthly basis. He recorded Cameron's ramblings, hoping to use them for a memoir for which the PM is keen to bag £1 million. The name of the columnist? None other than Steer Pike's old friend Daniel Finkelstein, now Lord Finkelstein. And the newspaper in question is, of course, The Times. Setting aside the question of whether the paper's editors knew, Steer Pike assumes not, otherwise readers would no doubt have been told. Steer Pike can't help but wonder why this cozy relationship was not disclosed in the long Leveson inquiry, one that purported to look into inappropriate links between politicians and journalists. Cameron even volunteered a bizarre rule that he lists all of his meetings with senior journalists, but left Fink off the list. That's what he calls himself in his Twitter account, Danny the Fink. Perhaps Fink doesn't have the same meaning in Britain as it does in this part of the world. And William Briggs writes today that the culture war is nearing its end. The war is in its mop-up stage, but there can be no doubt about its conclusion. Reality will lose. Desired, backed by the oligarchy, will win. That doesn't mean that you have to surrender, though. It does mean that you will have to continue your fight underground. Like all wars in their final phase, there will always be pockets of fighting that continue, though with diminishing strength and frequency. Skirmishes will still occur even after treaties have been signed. Local uprisings will happen only to be put down. Some territories, lucky to be at the peripheries, might manage to break off and go in their own way. And he has attached a tweet from CTV News. Pregnancy, birth, and fertility care need to be more gender inclusive, advocates say. Only women have uteruses. Only women can give birth. How dare you? How dare you? Briggs continues, again, like in actual wars, most of the fighting was in regions strategically and tactically important. The devastation in these areas is heavy. Think about what happened to government and education. Yet some places remain almost unaffected and serene. For example, traditional and quiet religious orders. Yes, speaking about the tainter again, look at education, and not just the university system. Look at kindergarten to grade 12 education. The amount of money that is spent on this is absolutely shocking, and it continues to rise and rise and rise with no end in sight. What are the outcomes for the students? It is now common for students in the third grade not to know how to read. It's now a commonplace. It is now a commonplace in my country for graduates, high school graduates, to be functionally illiterate and to know almost nothing, say, of world history or anything like that. But these people still get paid. Class sizes must be made smaller. There's absolutely no evidence that smaller class sizes result in better outcomes. The research has been done by Richard Vedder, formerly of Ohio State University, and he came to the conclusion that the ideal class size was 35. And I believe the reason for that is that in a class of 35, discipline must be strong. Otherwise, it's impossible for anyone to learn anything. Now, Canadian schools are not as undisciplined as many American schools, many American public schools, I should say. But they are far less disciplined than they were in the past. And of course, this recent trend of, students working collectively. Well, how do we know what anyone is learning? If children cannot be, they don't even have the privacy of a desk anymore, it's going to be rather difficult for them to concentrate. But, putting people in desks in rows is hierarchical, and hierarchy is wicked. Briggs continues, Christopher Rufo is right that the majority of people are against teaching Caucasians require termination, or CRT, but that counts for little because in wars decide what the most powerful weapons win. Teachers' unions, for instance, have already vowed to continue promoting the evilness of whites in spite of any rules against it. True, the Baizu pushing this might come to grief when it is realized they are white too, but for now, they are triumphant. A trick was missed during COVID, and it's still possible. Teachers say, we are not going to return to the classroom. Okay, here's what. You've got 1 week to return to the classroom. If you don't, you're fired. We will take extraordinary measures, any measures necessary. If you're not willing to do your job, you're fired. Or how about we're just not going to pay you any more? But no, one of the problems with that is that a great many mothers of students have an entirely irrational attachment to school teachers, notwithstanding the fact that school teachers work exactly as hard as they want to. In my country, Alberta, BC, and especially Alberta, they are exceedingly well paid. It's almost impossible for them to be fired. But no, mothers have this strange attachment to teachers. I don't know that I'm as black-pilled as William Briggs is, for the reason that our elite is clearly running scared. I mean, if you look at what the Biden administration is doing, they're looking to provoke incidents, violent incidents, so they can use this as a justification for military action against so-called extremists. And that is not the sort of thing that a confident regime would do. But again, I'd commend to you William Briggs's essay, which you can find at wmbriggs.com. He writes a lot about COVID-19. He is a statistician by training and has taught statistics at Cornell. But very few people know anything of statistics. As I like to say, most people, including the experts in the media who've been lecturing us about COVID-19 this last year and a half, cannot understand the idea of proportionality and really have trouble with any number. larger than 1,000. I'm going to move on to Theater Thursday. Before I do, let's look at the chat. Hello to Ultra Testosterone. I'm sick of living in terror. South Africa is already there or here, says Birkin Sultanov. Don Willis says sometimes reasonable men must do unreasonable things. And he quotes the Talking Heads, David Byrne, you may say to yourself, my God, what have I done? Don Willens, Karen's equals seedless watermelon pie sliced and cubed in container. We didn't have pork and beans. We had beans and franks, says Don Willis. Okay. Oh, Yakarapala. Yes, let's go to the beginning. See, I scroll up from the bottom, and it often makes it difficult to follow the course of the conversation. One thing I like about him is that he hasn't turned into some career as a based black guy grifter routine selling leftists are the real racist stuff to boomers. Who would that be? I wonder. Compare poor parts of cities in Ukraine to any other diverse city in the world, says a tricky who. Don Willis says Baltimore war zone, save for a few hotel stadiums. Tourist, what? Go outside of that area at night, you would be a victim of crime. I visited Baltimore in, 2002. I wanted to see the Edgar Allan Poe's grave. And I was given directions at the Squid Port. The creep behind the counter said, I asked him, can you tell me how to find Edgar Allan Poe's grave? He said, Edgar Allan Poe? Who's that? Very amusing. Anyway, he gave me the directions, and I started walking there with my girlfriend, and I noticed that the part of town that we were walking through seemed completely deserted and really sketchy. That's not a journey that I would make today, given what I know about Baltimore. Yes, Johns Hopkins University is one of the reasons why Baltimore still exists. That is to say, why it is not completely collapsed. That the regime decides that we can find ways to pour money into cities that have almost completely lost their tax base. Star Rover says not a single student meets minimum math graduation requirement in some Baltimore high schools. Well, I don't know. I saw The Wire. I think it's overrated, but The Wire did give a pretty accurate depiction of what classrooms in Baltimore public schools are like. That is to say, it's impossible for anyone to learn anything. Impossible. Brandon Smith says, educating women has reduced the birth rate the world over. Yes. I read that the Parsis, who have the most educated women in the world, are going to literally disappear from the earth in another couple of generations because they have stopped having children entirely. Don Willis says a Prairie Home Companion reference we used to listen years ago with selective hearing, removing leftist snarky comments Garrison made. A simpler time. I think that Garrison Keillor is an excellent writer. I mean, his novels, his short stories, some of the most laugh out loud stuff I've ever read. Of course, he was canceled a few years ago over just, I don't know, he said something to a woman, or he looked at a woman in some way, or just, there's nothing there. What are the best states to live in during the collapse, says Dionysus? I don't know. I can't say. Oh, Yakorai Paula says, Mr. Tinksorg is a fascinating character in Northern Euro dissident right circles. He's half black, half Swede, who used to be a leftist, but he got fed up with the SJWs. Okay, I have heard of this person. Before I saw that tweet storm on South Korea. Okay, today's movie is from 1966, and it is called Lord Love a Duck. It is produced, directed, and co-written by George Axelrod. Axelrod was a rather remarkable person in American entertainment. He started off as a gag writer And then he wrote a play called The 7-Year Itch, which became a huge success. Most people will know The 7-Year Itch, which stars Tom Ewell and Marilyn Monroe, based on the movie version, which was directed by Billy Wilder. And Axelrod was not pleased with the adaptation of The 7-Year Itch because there's very little of the original that remains in the movie version. Now, Axelrod also wrote a play called Will Success Spoil Rock Hunter, which was a big hit. And then it was made into a movie by Frank Tashlin, starring Tony Randall and Jane Mansfield, a movie which I have reviewed on Theater Thursday, and which is a wonderful movie and very prescient. Unfortunately for Axelrod, Frank Tashlin kept the title. That's pretty much all that he kept. Axelrod wrote a number of movies. Yeah, that's what it's called. He wrote the movie version of Bus Stop, Breakfast at Tiffany's. He wrote the screenplay for John Frankenheimer's The Manchurian Candidate, which is one of the greatest movies ever made. And he wrote the screenplay for a film called How to Murder Your Wife, which came out in 1965, which I also reviewed on Theater Thursday, and which is one of the funniest movies ever made. It's also rather profound in its way. Lord Love-a-Duck was not a success. Axelrod directed one more film, The Secret Life of an American Wife, in 1968. And then I suppose he did mostly hack work, writing scripts for The Lady Vanishes, The Holcroft Covenant, The Fourth Protocol. He also wrote a few books. But this movie is one of the strangest movies that you could possibly see. It's based on a 1961 novel by Al Hine, and it stars Roddy McDowall, who was 38 years old when this movie came out, and he plays a 17-year-old in the movie. Roddy McDowall was English, and he had success in English films, and he had an enormous success in the film How Green Was My Valley. Then a couple of years after that, Lassie Come Home, he moved to America. He was, of course, in Planet of the Apes, and you can see him in one of his later movies, Fright Night, which came out in 1985, which is actually quite good, in which he plays a washed-up TV vampire presenter. Tuesday Weld is in this film. Apparently, she said that her work in Lord Love-a-Duck was the best that she had ever done. I can't say I ever found Tuesday Weld very attractive. She has these doll-like features which don't appeal to me. Of course, I'm very much in the minority in that regard. Lola Albright appears in this film. She won Silver Bear Award at the Berlin Film Festival for it. It's really a tremendous performance. And some people say that her performance as Tuesday Weld's mother appears to come from a rather different film. Her character is treated as a rather ridiculous character at the beginning, but then is invested with much pathos. She was a sex symbol on the TV show Peter Gunn, and as I say, for her to play both a mother role and the way that she is presented in this film is it's quite brave. And we get Ruth Gordon playing one of the many grotesques that she essayed. We have a comedy staple, Harvey Korman, as the school principal, We have Lynn Carey, who was also a singer who never quite made it, as, how shall I say, the most sexually outgoing of the students in this film. There's a blink if you miss and you'll miss it joke near the end of the film, where in a graduation scene, we can see that she is heavily pregnant. Max Showalter, who was a staple of comedy, broad comedy, for decades. You will have seen him in 16 Candles, where he plays one of the in-laws. And we have Joe Collins, who was a Playboy Playmate of the Year for 1965. What's this movie about? Well, it is a modern retelling of the Faust myth. Roddy McDowall plays a senior high school student called Alan Musgrave, and he calls himself Mollymauk, a bird which is thought extinct, but isn't. And he appears to have some kind of supernatural power, as well as being a genius and a man of tremendous physical strength, despite his diminutive stature. He is clearly rather besotted with Tuesday Wells' character, who is called Barbara Ann Green, and she reminds us many times in this film that she was named after two movie stars, Barbara Stanwyck and Ann Sheridan. At the beginning of the film, and this film has the structure, rather like Lolita, of we'll start at the end, go back to the beginning, and then go back to the end. If you go to my Twitter feed, you can see that there is a scene, a honeymoon scene, or a wedding day scene in Lord Love a Duck, which is very clearly an homage, and a very amusing one, to Lolita. In Lolita, when James Mason has married Shelley Winters, you see them in the now marital bed, and obviously James Mason is having some difficulties, and there is a portrait of Dolores on a nightstand, and we see James Mason looking at it, which caused some censorship problems. The League of Catholic Decency objected that this is unacceptable, because clearly James Mason is looking at the portrait of Lolita in order to make himself sexually excited. And the producer of the film, and Stanley Kubrick's partner at the time, James Harris, said that some, how shall I say, dissimulation was necessary. He insisted, oh, no, this was not our intention at all. He said, whereas it clearly was. And so a few frames were cut for that, and the film was accepted. Of course, the joke is that no one is going to look at a picture of Ruth Gordon in order to become sexually excited, which I think is a very good joke. At the beginning, Alan says, "Dear, sweet, simple-minded Barbara Ann," whose deepest and most heartfelt yearnings express with a kind of touching lyricism the total vulgarity of our time. So what does Barbara Ann want? Everything. Everybody has got to love me. Everybody. This is my year. My horoscope says I'm going to be famous. I'm a Capricorn and I can't miss. I deserve it too. I've been very good. I haven't done bad things with boys. Well, a little, but not really bad. And only if I liked a boy. So Alan has been stalking Barbara Ann, and he literally jumps from a tree to meet her, in what they like to call meet cute. And he has keys to the school, the new school, which is called Consolidated High School, which is also a very good joke because it has two meanings. The consolidation of education, where schools got bigger and bigger and bigger. But the idea, also the joke, is that the idea of the school as a factory, turning out people who are suitable for modern liberal democracy. And he takes her to the roof, and there's some wet cement there. And he gets her to write her name, and he has a talisman, which he shows her. And he doesn't write his name. And essentially, she has signed a contract with him, the same contract that Faust signed with Mephistopheles. And Roddy McDowall's character has the ability, well, it seems to have the ability of transmogrification, that he can appear any place. And that what Barbara Ann wants, Barbara Ann gets. What Alan's motivation in all this is rather a mystery. He says at the end that, he did it for love, but he never really makes any attempt at a pass at Tuesday Weld. Tuesday Weld, she's attracted to the lunkhead quarterback of the football team, who Roddy McDowall somewhat improbably knocks out using judo. And she becomes obsessed with a moral counselor who is rather an appalling fellow, a weak fellow called Bob Bernard, Stella Ruth Gordon's son. Before I talk more about the Faust myth, I wanted to mention that this is also a satire of what is known as the beach party film, which were kind of a sensation in the 1960s. And it's really pretty simple, that you get a bunch of young people and you put them on the beach and they dance. So you get, oh yes, I'm interested in, following up the trends. What are our young people interested in these days? Well, no, actually, people, well, that is to say, men went to beach party films because there are dozens or sometimes hundreds of good-looking women wearing almost nothing, gyrating. That's the appeal. Now, of course, in making this film, Axelrod obviously understood that his parody of the beach party film is it becomes a beach party film itself. And that if you like to watch films in which dozens or hundreds of attractive young women are gyrating, wearing little clothing, well, you could appreciate Lord Love a Duck for that reason. This is a rather brutal satire of all manner of things. Let's start with psychiatry, right from the very beginning. That Roddy McDowall is being interviewed by a psychiatrist, and he runs intellectual rings around her, and she keeps showing him Rorschach blots. And he finds great beauty in this, and the psychiatrist is disgusted and says, "Don't you understand that they are supposed to be dirty?" This film is a satire of modern education, as previously noted, and of the use of, how should I put it, rubbish language, a language which doesn't express what it is exposed to. Here's the principle. Weldon Emmett, E-double-M-E-double-T, talking to Mr. Beverly, a teacher. "Frankly, Beverly, I've been reevaluating your performance in plant skills. See, it used to be called botany, but now it's called plant skills for life. There's been talk, Beverly, talk. Do you think this material is too controversial for you?" "Mr. Emmett, I don't understand. I've been teaching botany for..." "We call it plant skills for life here at Consolidated, don't we, Beverly?" "I've been teaching plant skills for life for 30 years. Yes. I know all that. Be quick, man. What unit are you currently programming?" "Well, yesterday, for example, we covered the pistils and the stamen." "The what?" "The fertilization of the flowers. It's very beautiful. You know how the pistils give off the pollen and the stamen is the receptacle? I show how it gets from one to the other." "Good Lord, man. What kind of smut are you exposing these children to?" "It's life, sir. I try to make it..." "Don't burble to me about life, Beverly. Just keep the filth out of your classroom. Good Lord. The stamens and the pistils. Get your mind out of the gutter, man. Out of the gutter." And there's a tension, a very strong tension in this movie, filmed as it was in 1966, because it was only a few years later, 3 or 4 years later, that the production code was essentially abandoned, and you could put whatever you liked in a movie. Sexual tension. Oh, these are nice kids. Oh, just having fun. They're having sex. All right. There's a lot of double entendres in this film, and scenes which at the time, I suppose, would have seemed innocent to most people, but are really not so innocent. You know, again, you see a similar thing in Lolita. Oh, these are just nice, wholesome kids having a good time. Are they? Are they really? Because how do their parents think? Children tend to, adopt so much from their parents. And if their parents are leering, literally leering, and thinking of sex all the time, this is going to be passed on to their children. And so it is in Lord Love a Duck, that Tuesday Wells' mother, Marie, is a cocktail waitress. She is deeply ashamed of this. She is deeply ashamed that she is divorced. She is deeply ashamed that she has to wear a sort of faux Playboy bunny costume to work. Everything about her life is unsatisfactory, unhappy. She drinks constantly, smokes constantly. She doesn't seem to want to be alive. She has great hopes for her daughter, who, of course, was named after 2 movie stars, 2 being better than 1. We see a satire of modern religion with a drive-in church, and where we learn about the book of Leviticus. And of course, Leviticus, well, now it would be called, the story of Levi's story, or something like this. And the preacher gives a really crass summation of the great book of Leviticus, I suppose in an attempt to appeal to the young people. Tuesday Wells goes on a date with this idiot that she's besotted with, and he tells Ruth Gordon that he's gone to see the 10 Commandments. He says, I shouldn't have seen that. I've never seen the movie. Do you know have you seen it? She says, no. Well, what's it about? That's a pretty good joke, too. The movie called The 10 Commandments. You don't need to laugh at to know that The 10 Commandments is one of the most seen movies in history, to know that what's the 10 Commandments about. And Tuesday Wells says, well, I think the message is thou shalt not. Now, her betrothed, as he becomes, he is what you might call an abstinence educator. And this is very amusing to me. It always has been very amusing to me, because essentially abstinence education is this: sex, 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 don't do it. You're telling young people that sex is, it's the greatest thing in the world, the greatest feeling in the world, and it's almost irresistible. But you can resist it with these these handy tips that we're going to give you. Of course, the idea that putting young people in such close physical proximity, allowing them to go out on dates unchaperoned and the like, it's not really promoting abstinence and monogamy, is it? But no, the experts have spoken, and George Axelrod has a great deal of fun with all manner of experts. This film is a satire of commodification of youth, turning people into consumers, defining oneself by what one owns. For instance, cashmere sweaters. Now, I love cashmere. It's too expensive for me now, but Tuesday Wells' character is told of an exclusive club at her high school, but in order to join the club, one must have 12 cashmere sweaters. Well, She can't possibly afford 12 cashmere sweaters. She can't even afford one cashmere sweater. Now, Roddy McDowall reminds her that she has a divorced father who she never sees. So this is the solution to getting not 12, but 13, one better than 12 sweaters. How is that going to work? Guilt. You're going to guilt him out of this money because he's going to feel so bad for abandoning you that he thinks that he can buy your love with money, with goods. And two strange and rather uncomfortable, especially today, scenes follow with Tuesday Weld and Max Showalter, that he in effect takes his daughter on a date to one of those old-timey drive-ins where they put that long plate that holds the food, or whatever, that holds the food, from one end of the car to the other. And yes, they're clowning around with the food, just like teenagers would. And then he takes her to the cashmere sweater store where she learns about grape yum yum, pink put on, papaya surprise, periwinkle pussycat. And she is pretty much rousing herself to an orgasm, rolling around with these sweaters, screeching in delight, primping for her father, who is, let's say, rather excited himself. The point is fairly obvious that, for the idea that a father can buy his daughter's affection or have this kind of identification with, for instance, her clothing is unseemly, to say the least. Tuesday Weld decides that she wants to marry this stupid boy who is getting a PhD, and Ruth Gordon has his measure. She says, "My son is a product of the California school system, couldn't write a single English sentence if his life depended on it." Now, she wants this man, and she gets him, and Roddy McDowall does all he can to essentially bring them together. And they are married, but there is a difficulty that they end up at Mom's house on their wedding night. Roddy McDowall has brought this about by the simple expedient of spiking Ruth Gordon's drinks with alcohol. And so there is a non-consummation. Tuesday Weld says she wants a divorce, but there seems to be a serious question of whether the marriage was ever consummated, in which case it would be easy enough to get an annulment. We see the deterioration of Marie, Tuesday Weld's mother, which again I will say is enormously affecting, because we have thought of her as a clownish character, and she's not actually a clownish character. And some tremendous acting there. This movie, it heads to the conclusion where Tuesday Weld's character, Barbara Ann, she gets everything that she wants, and it makes her no happier than when she was at the beginning. But of course, there is one thing that she wants more than anything else, which is to be famous. And of course, this film is very prescient in this regard, as was the Frank Tashlin film, Will Success Spoil Rock Hunter? This mania with fame, which has now become universalized in America and elsewhere. The term fame was once associated with rectitude, with heroic deeds and the like. Now it just means a lot of people know you. We have a great deal of fun we meet the producer of the Beach Party movies, and we get a long list of possible beach party movies. And it's a very, very funny list, because I suppose when you have as much experience as a writer, and sometimes a hack writer as Axelrod was, then you learn how the sausage is made, as they say. This is a very, very funny movie. Now, a lot of people might find it to be somewhat over the top in its use of slapstick, but it's also it's a very sad movie as well. The idea that it's an early critique of the boomers, really. Someone like Axelrod was from the previous generation, and I think that he once said in an interview that one of the reasons he made this movie was to get back at his own children. Because, the boomers were told that, they're the greatest generation in history, the best educated generation in history, the most thoughtful, the kindest, etc., etc. And, well, obviously it wasn't true from the very beginning. Tom Wolfe famously wrote of a happiness explosion in America in the 1960s. And what this meant was that people want what they wanted because they wanted it, and they wanted it now. And that's what we see in Lord Love a Duck. And this film was unavailable for many years. And the previous edition was in a crummy DVD. You can watch it on Amazon Prime. There is a KL Blu-ray of it, which you can get for $15, and it looks good. It looks really good. Kino Lorber, and the photography is in black and white, and it's widescreen, which I love. And there's a lot of interesting camera angles and the sort of use of cinema verite techniques, which are very popular in the 1960s. I like this movie a great deal, and I'd say that it's a movie that you would have to watch more than once to get all that it has to offer, which is a lot. So those are my thoughts on Lord Love a Duck, which, of course, it's an English expression meaning essentially, oh my word, or something like that. So Oscar Toe says, Kevin, did you know that Amy Chua got JD Vance to write Hillbilly Elegy? No, I did not know that. Thank you for that. Kevin, I think you were splitting hairs earlier. Often there is little difference between the media and experts. I don't know about that, because I'm constantly being referred to these experts or fact checkers. I used to write stories for the media, and I was involved in doing my own fact checking. But apparently there is now a class of people called fact checkers. I don't know whether there's any kind of, religious ceremony they have to undergo before being consecrated as fact checkers. And let's have a final look at the chat. Birkin Seltenov says, I have noticed how loud Americans really are. Spent way too much time outdoors today. Yeah, you should hang around Chinese if you want loud. Tuesday Weld was good in Thief. James Caan was great in it, says Anne Run. Tuesday Weld was married to both Dudley Moore and Pinchas Zuckerman. How about that, eh? Kevin it's going to be difficult. Find it difficult when he goes to the chat for the last time. The last time? What? What does that mean? Now I'm scared. I'm scared. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you all for tuning in. Tomorrow is the book club, and I will be discussing Amy Chua's World on Fire, which, with what's going on in South Africa, more prescient than ever. Of course, when she writes about the influence and the practices of the Chinese in Southeast Asia, I'm thinking, how is this any different than Vancouver? And so I'll be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. If you like the show or any part of it, I appreciate it if you click on the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not done so already. If you like this, show and you'd like to make a donation to the live stream, very much appreciated at this time, especially so. My PayPal account is linked to kevin_grace@hotmail.com. Once again, kevin_grace@hotmail.com. If you are in Canada, donations can be made to the live stream directly via Interact at kevingrace@shaw.ca. And as always, I leave you with this. In these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.